a real pleasure to welcome to BBC Radio Scotland Pete Townshend of The Who. How are you?
I'm in good shape, I think.
You think? Well, you look in good shape. We're here to talk about the new multi-format box set version of Who's Next and Lifehouse, which is celebrating the 50th anniversary with what many people regard as The Who's greatest ever studio album. As you were carefully compiling the collection of 132 tracks, 89 of which are previously unreleased, what kind of experience was it for you personally? Did it throw up any real surprises?
You know, well, there are a couple of things really about this are really special to me. One is the fact that we were able to include the graphic novel, which I've been working on for a couple of years, to give some sense of cohesion to the backstory of Lifehouse. So I wrote a film script which was a bit naive, but it told a story, and I wrote the songs around that story. But the story went into the vaults and never really came out. So the graphic novel, I suppose some people might call it a comic, actually tells the story. But the main fun that I had was going back to the demos, because these recordings that I did for the songs to present to The Who, I took tremendous care over. You know, I was always pretty lackadaisical about demos because I knew they would never be published, except in occasions like this, of course. But it was a real thrill to go back and hold the tapes in my hand and open them up, and it all came back, really. Also, you know, working with Matt Kent, who was the chronicler of the backstory, you know, just really getting a sense of what it was that I took on, sort of nuts, really, after Tommy, which was a 8-month recording process. Yeah. You know, the thing with Lifehouse was that we struggled. You know, we struggled a lot with some of the technical advances. You know, we were up against Pink Floyd at the time, who were doing, you know, quadraphonic concerts and, you know, huge selling albums with fantastic studio quality, and I really wanted to keep up, principally with them. You know, they're all friends, and but there was a sense that their studio quality was something that really we needed to match. So going back to it all, realizing that it was all there ready to go, and really I shouldn't really blame Kit Lambert, our manager in the early days, was so important to me. He helped me become a really good songwriter. He was a great supporter and mentor of me musically and emotionally, artistically, and on every level. But, you know, he had a personal collapse of his own. He was supposed to be recording us. He was supposed to be producing us. And he actually also was obsessed with making a movie of Tommy, which he wanted to direct himself, and undermined everything that I was trying to do. He was in New York and I was in London. So I just ended up literally just climbing the walls and kind of giving up. I brought in the well-known record producer Glyn to do a regular album, and the album went out and it did very well, and it's gone down in history as being, you know, probably one of the most important albums that The Who have done, particularly songs like, you know, Behind Blue Eyes and Won't Get Fooled Again and Barbara O'Reilly. Song Is Over. You know, these are really fantastic songs. I'm so proud of them. But we were hoping for something much bigger. Now what we have is a huge doorstop.
Yeah. Yeah, the 3 albums that kind of paved the way for Lifehouse and, you know, Who's Next were, you know, A Quick One, While He's Away in 1966, followed by The Who Sellout in 1967, and of course the masterpiece Tommy in 1969. All of those albums had a kind of concept running through them. Was it always your intention that the next record that would follow that would have some kind of theme or some kind of narrative? Because at the time you said it was the most ambitious concept that you'd ever worked on.
Yes, that's right. And I think, you know, when I look back at my solo career as well, I've always done that. I've always tried to gather songs together under an umbrella, not always a story, not always a theme. You know, for example, right now I'm writing a bunch of songs and the theme is quite simply a young man in the mod days, or not necessarily the mod days, the post-mod days, walking through a street in Soho thinking about jazz. That's about it. That's about, you know, It helps me to focus. It helps me to come up with images and ideas, you know. And I got teased with Tommy on the subject of it being, you know, whether or not it was a proper opera or not. I didn't really care what people thought. But, you know, now it's I just went to Chicago to see a new theatre production of it at the Goodman Theatre. And, it's so relevant today, the story, particularly the whole thing about neurodiversity and domestic collapse of families and the pressure on children that are a little bit different from the norm. But, Tommy is a story of the post-war trauma that so many of us in my generation went through because, to put it brutally, we were sort of forgotten. And when I got to work with Lifehouse, I sort of skipped from this obsession with the past, with the obsession with being the post-war generation, my generation, why don't you all off, all of that stuff, to looking into the future. And when I looked into the future, what I saw was quite scary. I'm imaginative, of course, but a lot of what I saw was based on talking to musicians, philosophers, psychologists. So when I looked into the future, what I saw was quite scary. It was that, the world was, funnily enough, in 1971, the front of Time magazine said by the year 2000, the Earth will be frozen over.
We're almost there.
Well, what's interesting is that when I spoke to somebody that I knew who was a National Trust warden, he said, Pete, that was what was supposed to happen. We were supposed to be suffering the big freeze. And what's actually happened, of course, is we've turned it around, but maybe a little bit too far. We're now cooking. Yeah. But anyway, it was an obsession with the future, with the frailty of the planet, but also the frailty of the individual who was perhaps looking for spiritual answers, and where would they find them, and would music be the answer? And as a musician and as a romantic about the power of music, I'm very romantic about it. I'm a great believer in the power of music. I committed it all to paper, and Lifehouse is what came out of it.
Now, we're going to punctuate the interview with some tracks from the fantastic new box set, and I've just kind of really cherry-picked them at random, so I thought I'd start off with this one. It's from disc number 2, the Lifehouse demos between 1970 and 1971, and it's a song which I guess laid the ground for, Baba O'Reilly, one of the standout tracks from, Who's Next, when it was released later that year. Tell us a little bit about Teenage Wasteland, because it's amazing to listen through and hear all the little elements and all the little lines of lyrics which were kind of reinterpreted into Baba O'Reilly, which of course came a few months later.
That's correct, yeah. In fact, it's not a great song by any means, so anybody listening, put your teeth in.
I would dispute that. I think it is a great song.
It's one that I don't think the band recorded. It never felt to me like a Who track. Maybe that's the way I should put it. But it was meant to set the scene. As you say, the song that was mainly meant to set the scene was Pure and Easy, which was left off the Who's next album. That's the one, there once was a note, pure and easy, flying by like a note flittering by. I can't remember the words, but
like a breath rippling
by. Thank you. And, that was the idea, that music was going to be, in a sense, the breath, the fresh air that society needed and presumably needs today. Yeah. Teenage Wasteland was to set up the idea that there was this, literally a wasteland. Funnily enough, the image of Teenage Wasteland, it came from after the Isle of Wight Festival, the first one. I think Bob Dylan played at it. And I suppose you would say, supported him. And we played Tommy there. Afterwards, the devastation that the crowd left was so awful that our road crew, we had about 40 at the time, cleaned it up. They were just so ashamed of what happened. And when I see festivals today on the shit that people leave behind, I just think, what is wrong with teenagers today? But, we were the same. We were exactly the same. And, I'm not going to take my tent home. But I think what happened is that some guy took a photo of it and sent it to me. And underneath, he entitled this photo of all this devastation, Teenage Wasteland. And I thought, wow, what a great line. And so I poached it and used it as a way of describing the emptiness that I think we all felt in the 70s. I can't really describe it. It's interesting because our hope was that our great rock and roll music revolution, of the early 60s was going to lead us to a fine and better place. but it didn't seem to be doing that. But my main passion was watching what happened with audiences at rock events. You know, I'd been at Monterey Pop, I'd been at Woodstock, I'd been at both the Isle of Wights. You know, what actually happened at music events is that they were involved in a congregation, a meeting of energy and consciousness that was much, much higher than just going and seeing a bunch of rock bands. The fact is that the audience was more important than the performers. That's the way that I saw it. So with Lifehouse, I was determined, in a sense, to try to tell that story, to tell the story about the fact that, you know, music performers need their audience almost more than the audience needs the music, which is not what many otherwise smart musicians believe. They believe that the music is the thing. What is the thing is the gathering. And this is why festivals today are still so important.
Let's hear the song now then. From Disc 2, from Who's Next Lifehouse box set, this is a very early demo called Teenage Wasteland. This is Billy Sloan on BBC Radio Scotland. You join me with my special guest Pete Townshend of The Who. We're talking about the brand new 50th anniversary box set of Who's Next and Lifehouse. And it's kind of well known, Pete, you know, we heard the demo of Teenage Wasteland a few moments ago. It's well known that, you know, you have this system of working where you do a demo where you play the drums and you play the bass and you play the guitar and you sing on the track. Then you hand a copy or let the rest of the band, you know, Roger, John and Keith as it was in those days. Do you record those songs with those band members in mind, or do you just hand over the demo and you look for some kind of input and kind of, you know, stamp of theirs to be put on it?
Oh, God, I wish I could. But, you know, I could never play the drums like Keith, and neither could I play the bass like John. You know, they were both quite extraordinary. So, no, I wanted the songs to be complete. And sometimes I put down ideas, and John in particular would be very careful to listen to what I put down on the bass and use it if it was useful to him. I think the same is true of Keith. But no, I did it partly because, oh God, you know, it's not a great thing to admit, but I don't like collaborating much.
Yeah.
You know, this is only when I'm in creative, you know, when I'm on stage with a band, like everybody else, I like to join in and offer ideas and listen, be a part of a musical collaboration. But in the studio, you know, there's been no documentary about me making my demos because I don't think I could do it with a cameraman in the room. It feels so private, so personal, but it's also a huge enthusiasm. I had a world-class recording studio in my house, in my flat. You know, when I was 16, I met a guy who was a TV guy, a guy called Barry Gray, and he showed me how to get these, you know, machines from Abbey Road and from places like that, and how to bounce back from one machine to the other. So I was making great demos. Oh, and by the way, Kenny Everett once called me up and said, would you help me put together a studio at home so I could do my radio show from my bedroom? And I think that was in the 70s.
And I mean, while you were in the studio surrounded with all your hardware and your musical instruments, you were kind of experimenting with synthesizers, and it was very much kind of learning on the job, wasn't it? Because, you know, you were finding out how to actually physically operate these pieces of very complicated equipment.
Yeah, and other people were doing it too. My friend, the record producer Chris Thomas, was hired by George Martin to operate the Moog synthesizer that the Beatles were using at that time. You know, I think that even the Rolling Stones fiddled about with synthesizers for a while. You know, everybody, it was the new kid on the block. And my interest really in synthesis was at two levels. One was I really liked the fact that they could create new textures and sounds to replace the absence of orchestral textures and sounds in rock music. And also, you know, you could control it yourself. But also the idea of it being something that could be computer controlled, which of course is true today. Now we can control synthesizers with computers, because then it could be used to reflect human emotions, human conditions, human DNA, all kinds of stuff that would make music, electronic music, more personally viable. But I think the synthesizer was Oh, man, it was an education. And today still, when I'm in my studio, today it's fantastic that you can learn about a new music machine or a synthesizer or a bit of electronic gear just by going on YouTube. So I'm learning every day. It keeps me alert, keeps me alive, and I love it. I love studios.
In February of 1971, with the help of Frank Dunlop, the director of the Young Vic in London, you decided to organise a kind of series of live workshops where the Who would go into that tiny theatre in the Waterloo area of the capital, and you would set up and you would invite people to come along, let the public in to watch you up close and how the songs were evolving. What were you hoping to get from the audience? What was the kind of feedback that you were looking for from them?
I was hoping that there would be individuals who would commit to the idea of becoming volunteers, to be a part of the musical process of being reflected, in a sense, by electronic music patterns, themes, around which we could compose songs. So we would compose songs on the spot based on electronic music stuff, which would be done in a workshop in the back room at the Young Vic. And what actually happened was that we did it in the middle of the day. It wasn't announced. And most of the people that came were just young teenage kids who actually didn't even know who the Who were. There were no volunteers. Oh, and by the way, I was one of the founders of the Young Vic. I was involved with Laurence Olivier and the whole bunch of people that were involved. I was one of the early patrons of it. So it was a natural shoe-in for me to ask Frank if we could do our workshops there. But Frank didn't really understand what I was trying to do either. He has since admitted that.
Yeah, he's quoted as saying Pete's co-workers did not think Lifehouse was getting anywhere, and I think Pete lost heart. And round about the same time, Roger was quoted as saying that you came up with a script that didn't make any sense. None of us could grasp it, but it did have some great ideas. So when did you get the kind of feeling that, this was an idea that was going on in your head and going on in your mind, but it wasn't making much sense, if I can use that phrase, to the other people that you were working with?
I think I didn't care. I didn't care whether Roger understood it. I don't want to be dismissive of him, but that's how I felt. I don't think any of the band knew what the hell was going on in Tommy.
But surely they would have to understand it to do it justice.
No, they weren't involved. They were just the band.
Right.
I was the diabolical leader of the great musical experiment, and I expected to be able to handle it. I had supporters. I had Tim Suster, I had Roger Powell, who went on to work with Todd Rundgren. I had Peter Zinoviev, who invented the EMS synthesizer. I even had meetings with Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. I was really on the ball technologically. The band were just there to be the Who. This was a Who project. This needed the Who to deliver it. So I didn't really mind that they didn't seem to understand it. But that's interesting because in actual fact, Roger was the person who I think understood it the best. He helped me with a revision a couple of years later, and some of those revisions come up in the graphic novel, which is included in the box set. So you can see that the project, I was not a film writer, but, I think now we've got to the present day, the idea, for example, of people being brainwashed by entertainment and the consequent sense of experience that you get from overkill exposure to deep, dark entertainment would change who you are. I think we get that today, but we didn't get it then. The idea then was that what I was talking about was feeding people lifetimes of experience down into experience suits, into which we would be forced to go and live in order to survive because air quality was so foul in the fiction. But there were two barrels to the script. The first barrel was the fiction, the story, the movie. But the second barrel was I wanted to create real, authentic rock and roll events with a real, authentic rock and roll band like The Who, which would be featured in the fictional movie. Yeah. I think today it would be something, mixing documentary images with fiction would be something that we see happen quite a lot. So it was ambitious, but and it was tricky to understand. But the problem was, for me, I didn't have Kit Lambert. It was as simple as that.
Because at his suggestion, I think the next piece of the jigsaw was you relocated to the record plant in New York City. And I guess that would have been your first time to actually put the songs down in a proper studio setting. And you had said previously, and you'd said all along, that Kit Lambert was this guy who was very, very encouraging. And when everybody was thinking it was ridiculous to be trying to write a rock opera, he was the guy who was telling you, no, go ahead and do that. You said they always wanted you to do something was important. But when you got to New York, there were so many distractions. It's 24 hours a day. Everything's happening 24 hours a day. Kit Lambert had a bit of a drug problem. You were worried that, the same thing was going to happen to Keith Moon. So how was it possible to be creative with all that other stuff going on around you?
Well, we had the demos of the songs in question. We had my very, very fine demo of Behind Blue Eyes, a great demo of Won't Get Fooled Again, terrific demo of Pure and Easy, a great demo of Barbara O'Reilly. We were able to just pick those demos out and do what we always had done in the past, which is to go into a studio with Kit and work. But after the second day, I looked through the window and Kit had gone. We were being produced by the engineer, I think his name was Jack Adams, and a guy that I knew and had worked with another artist in New York a couple of times. And Jack seemed to be all over the shop. And I was in there talking in this control room, talking to him in this fabulous new studio called East Lake, I think, in New York. And a heroin dealer walked in, and slapped down a packet of Brown. And I said, "Who's this for?" And he said, "Oh, it's not for me. It's not for me." And I said, "Well, who is it for?" And he kind of winked, and I realized it was for Kit. Kit had started to smoke heroin. The fact is that it did mean that he was in another world, in another space, and he wasn't that interested in me anymore. He wasn't interested in me as his project.
Yeah.
He'd moved on. He was working with an artist called Patti LaBelle, and also with Arthur Brown. He had a #1 album of single, an album with Arthur Brown, who'd I'd discovered, but he produced for Track Records. So he was in his own world, and he was also determined to make a movie of Tommy. He wanted to direct it. So I lost him, and it took me a long time to work out how to survive without him, to be honest, because he was I didn't need him to write the songs, but I needed somebody to play the songs to, who would tell me what worked and what didn't work. I'd become very dependent on him.
Mm-hmm. We're going to hear a track from the Record Plant sessions now. It's version number 1 from disc number 4. This is a very early version of Behind Blue Eyes.
No one knows behind blue eyes.
This is Billy Sloan on BBC Radio Scotland. You join me with my special guest Pete Townshend of The Who, talking about the brand new 50th anniversary box set of Who's Next in Lifehouse. And we were talking a few moments ago, Pete, about working in the record plant in New York City. You then moved on in April of 1971 to Olympic Studios in London with Glyn Johns as the associate producer. Now, he had just come straight off the back of Beggar's Banquet and Let It Bleed, where he'd been the engineer for the Rolling Stones, and also the Get Back sessions, which morphed into Let It Be in 1970. He was the chief engineer for the Beatles, Abbey Road on that. So when you get into the recording studio, when did it become obvious that, it was maybe time to, put the Lifehouse project to one side and just concentrate on making an album, if that makes sense?
Well, I sort of half did that. I half put it aside. But I did want to make a double album. And, I'd written a double album worth of demos, and I was still writing songs. But Glyn wanted to do a single album, and when he put the tracks together and assembled it, it was clear that this was the right thing to do. It was also a kind of an angelic message to me. Glyn is an extraordinary acoustic studio engineer. He produces magic. He's not the easiest person to be around in the studio. He's extremely good looking and good company, but he just works. The Who were famous for drinking and having fun, and Glyn didn't put up with any of that rubbish. He just got down and made the album. When he presented me with the single album, I thought, this this is a great record, if I'd heard it from another artist. And to be honest, although Kit Lambert was fabulous for me as a songwriter, he was not a great audiophile record producer. A lot of the early Who recordings sounded a bit tinny. And, he was always trying to get the needles in the red. He wasn't a technician. I loved working with him, but he wasn't the greatest engineer. So actually working with Glyn and suddenly doing an album with a guy who, as you say, had worked with all these fantastic artists and really honed his craft. Glyn was in a band called The Presidents and was a good-looking man. He could have been a star. He decided to devote himself to working with artists and has made some of the best-sounding records ever. He's certainly the premier UK recording engineer. There are many in America, but he holds the crucible, really, for the UK.
That was why he was inducted, of course, into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and deservedly so. Take us, Pete, if you can, just for a few moments, inside the walls of the recording studio at Olympic when you were laying down these tracks for what became Who's Next. Just go through the band members one by one. I mean, you'd always said that Roger, you felt, had really found his true voice on Tommy. But, I mean, when you listen to these demos and when you listen to, the live tracks from the Young Vic and also from Fillmore West in San Francisco, he was singing out of his skin, wasn't he?
Yeah, I think by that time, we'd become aware that Led Zeppelin were snapping at our heels and eventually, of course, in heavy rock terms, overtook The Who. But I think, Robert Plant was a shrieker. He copied the way that Roger looked on stage. He had his own thing, but, Robert Plant was somewhere between Roger Daltrey and Stevie Marriott from The Faces. He found his own feet in the end. But I think Roger was aware that he had to really sharpen up, and he did. He started to really regard his voice as an instrument and to really take care of himself and to take, he didn't use drugs, he didn't drink a lot, he had his issues and his eccentricities, but he really looked after himself. The rest of the band would be living hard without question. Mm-hmm. But as I said, Glyn wouldn't allow the band to live hard on his sessions. So the sessions at Olympic were very disciplined. We had very good demos to work with. We knocked off the songs really quite quickly. I think we did the whole record in 2 weeks.
And of course you had the advantage of the ultimate rhythm section. In the red corner you had the Ox, John Entwistle, and in the blue corner you had the one and only Keith Moon. Let's start with John first. It's been said that over the years he played his bass guitar more like a lead guitar. What was so special about him as a musician and a player?
I think you have to look at what John was made of, in a sense. He was a boy abandoned, not completely, but his mum and dad broke up when he was a little boy, and his dad went back to Wales, which is where he came from, I think. And John and his dad got on very well, but they didn't see a lot of each other. So he's brought up by a stepfather, and music began with him with his sort of congregational church connection. He used to play the bugle in the Boys Brigade. So he learned to read music in a primitive way. And when he and I first got together, he decided for some reason to play the bass, not because he wouldn't be able to play the guitar, he could have easily done that, but because everybody was playing the guitar in 1959. Everybody was playing the guitar. Lonnie Donegan had just got a lot of skiffle hits. So had Nancy Whiskey. The Shadows had released Apache. Everybody was trying to play the guitar, and in America you had Elvis and Eddie Cochran and the Everly Brothers. It was all guitar, 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 bloody guitar. And I think he just decided to play the bass because ultimately I think his main passion was brass instruments. When we got to record Quadrophenia, he produced a whole stack of brass instruments and could actually emulate an orchestra and did so on that record. He could play, the bass euphonium, he could play cornets, he could play anything, French horn. He was a brilliant, brilliant musician. So there I was on my guitar, and it was him and me. This is before we even met Roger. smashing up amplifiers if they buzzed at me in the wrong way. I couldn't really play. I don't know that I can really play that well today. I still throw myself into it with eye shades on, hoping that I'll hit a decent bum note. But right from the beginning, John was a musician. That was his thing. He was involved in music, and he was involved in it as a craft. So he practiced, and he practiced long and hard. Meanwhile, when I should have been practicing the guitar, because I was the lead guitarist in a big rock band, I was writing songs. That's what I did. So I would tuck myself away, and the only guitar playing I would do would be if I happened to play guitar in a demo. John practiced and practiced and practiced, and I think in a sense excelled to such an extent that he left himself behind. His fingers were extraordinary. He invented the double tapping technique that people use today. Eddie Van Halen extended it on the electric guitar, but John was doing it years before anybody else.
That only leaves one person, and it would be remiss not to mention the one and the only Keith Moon. There was a great quote from you in which you said his drumming was an extension of his personality, his ego, his grandiosity, his ridiculousness, and his sense of humour, because a lot of what he did was incredibly funny. What was it like working with him? I mean, we know what he was like on the road, just the crazy stuff that he got up to. But what was it like working with him in the studio? Did you have to rein him in all the time, or did you just let him sit back on that drum stool and be Keith Moon?
Well, I would have done. I think Glyn Johns, when he worked with him, tried to rein him in. And I can remember Kit Lambert always going in and saying, Keith, I'm taking away your cymbals. You're hitting too many cymbals. And just literally used to take all his cymbals away. And then we would add them on afterwards. But he was all those things. But the most important thing about him, and this is true of John too, is he listened. He listened really acutely. He listened to what I did, he listened to what John did, and he listened to what Roger did. He I don't know how he managed to do it, but he followed. He didn't lead. He didn't lay down a beat. He followed. He decorated. He responded. He reacted. In the days, the Fillmore days when I would stop the music and sit with my guitar and noodle about until I found something interesting to develop, Keith was right there. And John was such a profoundly expert musician, he would pick up what I played by ear. So it was like having two musicians who were an extension of myself, but also wonderful additions because they could do things I couldn't do. It was sometimes difficult to work with Keith because he didn't lay down a beat. So I was very confined to being the rhythm guitar player, holding down the beat. He was a bit like the collection of 5 drummers at the back of a big 60-piece orchestra. You've got the kettle drummer, the bass drummer, the guy that bangs the gong, the person that bangs the xylophone, the man that plays the big cymbals. Keith Moon played them all at the same time, but it was decorative. It was flourishes. It was additions. He made this little band that we were with just 3 musicians in the band and a singer sound like an orchestra sometimes.
It's almost hard to believe that we lost Keith Moon 44 years ago at the age of 32 and John Entwistle 20 years ago at the age of 57. In 2023, particularly when you were working on this Who's Next in Lifehouse project, do you think about them every day?
I think about them a lot. Yeah, I think about them a lot. And I think about, too, I've got friends that go right back to the beginning of my life, school friends, some of whom have died recently. But one of my best friends from school died recently. And, I get to meet his kids and they want to hear stories about what it was like back in the old days. I remember Lord Goodman, the old peer of the realm, a fundraising thing once saying to me, Pete, don't grow old. And I said, why not? And he said, well, 2 things. One is that you get to my age and all your friends are dead. And the other thing is you can't piss. So, I think it's a bit strange being in a world where everybody around you is, I'm pushing 80 now. So I'll be 80 in a couple of years. And I think, I want to reach out and remember those people and be a part of who they were and who they still are if they're still around, because one feels that you have a debt to the people that supported you when you were young. And if they're around, I try to stay in contact with them and try to see them if I can. And so it's terrible to wake up and realise that John and Keith, who was such a huge part of my life, are gone, and that Roger, who's still around, he and I live nearly 100 miles apart, and we were never very sociable with each other before. So although I see him when I'm working, he's not really a mate. He likes to say that we're mates, and of course when we work together we are, but do you know what I mean? I don't have that reason to go down to the Who studio in Battersea and know that I'm going to have a month making a record, and from start to finish it's going to be incredibly good fun and a lot of boozing.
Well, let's remember Keith and John in the best way possible. Let's go to the Olympic Studios disc, which is number 5 on the Who Lifehouse and Who's Next box set. This is a brilliant version of a John Entwistle composition. This is the Who with My Wife.
Yeah.
Let's go to Who's Next in 1971, and this is the sound of the Who with Getting in Tune. Billy Sloan on BBC Radio Scotland. You join me in conversation with Pete Townshend. We're talking about the 50th anniversary box set that's just been released of Who's Next in Lifehouse. And Pete, you know, when you come out of, you know, the Olympic Studios with Glyn Johns, you had an album that you were delighted with. You know, it sounded great. It now had to look good as well. And to do that, you recruited a photographer called Ethan Russell. And one day, in fact, it was the 4th of July, 1971, the band were travelling between Sheffield and Leicester. And for some bizarre reason, perhaps you can explain why, you stopped at a slag heap which had this big concrete structure on it, and you pretended to be urinating against it. You know, where did the whole Who's Next album cover concept come from? Was it just you were driving down the road and you thought, let's do it?
I think we were driving down the road and we needed a piss. I don't get it. I mean, a few people have said to me recently, oh, it has mystical meaning. I don't get it. I suppose it must have some poetic meaning to some people, but I don't. You know, for me, it was a slag heap. And these big concrete structures were erected to hold the slag heap in place so they didn't drift. And we stopped and Ethan took a picture and it was elected to be the album cover. I'm not sure that anybody in the band actually had very much to do with it. Ethan was there. He was one of Glyn Johns' best friend. Glyn actually called his first son Ethan after Ethan. I think he was his godfather. Ethan is a wonderful photographer. He took some fabulous photos subsequently for the Quadrophenia inner sleeve. But he couldn't crack it with Lifehouse. So none of us could come up with an idea that kind of encapsulated the whole thing. So it felt to me like a bit of an afterthought, to be honest. But some people seem to like it. I don't know.
And it became one of the most iconic album covers of all time. Of course, you know, as soon as the album hit the shops, the band once again hit the road to promote Who's Next all around the UK and Europe. And that was very significant for me because I bought my first ever single was Won't Get Fooled Again in the blue picture sleeve, which I still have to this day. And I went to my first ever gig, which was on the 21st of October 1971 at Green's Playhouse in Glasgow. The tickets were 85 pence each. And it was a life-changing moment. I make no bones about it. It's the reason I'm sitting here 45 years later talking to you now, having been a music journalist and a broadcaster for all that time. It had a real kind of, you know, life-changing power for me just hearing those songs on stage. You know, what did it give you over the years?
I don't know. I go to as many concerts as I can, which is not that many. It's quite difficult being a well-known face going to see other artists. So you end up backstage and you don't get a particularly good sound. The best place to hear a band or any music is out front. Is out front, yeah. I remember that gig. I remember Green's Playhouse. I remember, you know, if it's good, it's Green's.
I've got a piece of the original carpet, which I think is the only piece still in existence, and it's never been on a floor, so it's mint condition. And when you put it together, it says it's good. It's Green's. It was laid on the floor when the theatre opened way back in 1927.
I remember that. I remember them cutting up the carpet and sending it out. I think I got sent a bit at one point because we loved playing in Glasgow. I mean, it could be dangerous sometimes because there was always an element of pubs closing very, very late at night, sometimes at 11:30, and people just storming into gigs and creating trouble. But wow, I loved playing in Glasgow. I loved, the Scottish audiences, and it was great playing in Edinburgh recently. I'd never been up to the castle. I'd never experienced the magic of that place, but I'd always loved Edinburgh too. I think both places are unique among cities in the world, among the finest cities in the world, because like the finest cities in the world, they're by the sea. You forget that with Glasgow. You forget that with Edinburgh. There's ozone in the air. There's sea air very nearby, and you can get to the sea easily, and it's magical. I think it affects the way that music works in real life. Anyway, that's enough of that. Stroking the Scots. But I think I know that Roger remembers the gig at Green's.
And next year is also going to be another big anniversary for you, because it will be the 60th anniversary. Unless anybody can tell me anything different, it will be the 60th anniversary from when you played your first ever gig in Scotland, which was September of 1964. You were still known then as the High Numbers, and you opened for Lulu and the Lovers at the Kelvin Hall in Glasgow. Now, I think that's the first time you ever played north of the border. So next year it's 60 years since you first crossed the border and, blessed us with your music.
Oh, what's amazing is I think Keith and I definitely went to Lulu's.
That's right. She still talks about it in Denison, the East End of Glasgow, and you had a party until 5 o'clock in the morning.
The music was a bloody accordionist.
There you are. Well, we've got to make you feel welcome.
But I think she was either 15 or 16. I can't remember, but it was some significant birthday. I think she was 16.
Pete, is there an end game for all this? You mentioned a few moments ago that you're coming up for your 80th birthday. Are you looking ahead? Would you like to still be doing this in another 10 years? Or is there going to come a time where you think, I've had an amazing career, I've really made my mark as a musician and as a songwriter. It's time to just kind of hang up my spurs and that's enough?
I think I've got one problem, and that's that I really like boats, and they're expensive.
Right.
I've got a really lovely boat, and one of my missions, one of my great passions, is to come up to the Western Isles and do a cruise up there. I've been meaning to do it for years. I've mainly been out in the Caribbean where I keep my boat, or in the south of France, and I've always wanted to go up to Scotland. So I like to keep active because it keeps the spare cash flowing. The money, I'm not hard up, can't pretend to be hard up, but I don't like to spend unwisely unless I'm doing something unwise. And what I think I'm doing, which is unwise at the moment, is staying in the Who. But I have to say that the last 3 or 4 years, I've suddenly realised it's not that I should be grateful. Of course I'm grateful. I'm so glad to be alive, and I'm so glad to have survived, and I'm so glad to be able to do shows with Roger, whose voice is getting better, I think, better and better all the time. And I'm enjoying it. So, I had a great time at Edinburgh. I loved it. We did 2 shows in a row there. It was fantastic, and so, you do that. And for years and years and years, I was very indifferent about performing. I could take it or leave it. I didn't get the rush that other artists seem to get from being in front of an audience. I would look at the audience and I would see, if you like, I would see my patrons. I would see people presenting me with problems that needed to be solved. As a songwriter, I'm saying. So they would be my inspiration, my subject matter, as it were. So I never really saw myself as somebody that needed the love of an audience, but I'm getting it now. I'm thinking, well, I'm 78 years old, and I go and I perform and I get all this incredible affection, I'm very, very lucky.
Playing live was really crucial to the whole development of Who's Next in Lifehouse. So let's go back to a very early live recording in 1971 at the Young Vic, and this is Love Ain't For Keeping. You're listening to Billy Sloan in conversation with Pete Townshend here on BBC Radio Scotland. Let's finish on Lifehouse then. You said once upon a time that you reckon that Lifehouse was the one that got away, but there's a great quote in the book that comes with the box set, which you say, "I use the word audacious to describe my plans. In fact, the fiction and the experiment were both flawed and neither were properly realised. But some wonderful music came from the project, and the idea has always held me in thrall." Even though it was problematic, even though it perhaps didn't go the way that you thought it was going to go, you still must take some real satisfaction knowing that the end result, Who's Next in 1971, is one of your most accomplished, if not greatest ever studio albums.
Yeah. I mean, I think the other thing is that sometimes we set off to do one thing and we end up doing another. And sometimes what we set out to do is, whether it's audacious or overambitious or just bloody stupid, the angels gather and steer us down the right path. And looking back, I know that's a sort of a rather hippie-ish thing to say, but I do feel that I was steered down the right path with this project. I think it's better for me today to see that all these are crazy ideas this ex-art school boy had when he was 26 are now being regarded as being interesting and feasible, in 2023. It feels to me as though, I've been vindicated in a sense. So I've had to wait a long time, but I'm so glad to be here. I'm really, really proud of this box set. I think a lot of, Universal have put a lot of energy into it, everybody that's been involved in it. But one of the best extras for me is the fact that, the big box set includes the graphic novel. So it's a colourful, light-hearted, quite comedic in some ways, but definitely carefully structured version of the story, which really helps to kind of give a really solid background to what I set out to try to achieve, because so much of that was experimental kind of workshop stuff, the kind of stuff that you see Brian Eno doing these days, that you see David Byrne doing, or you see, these kind of, if you like, arty-farty art school people doing stuff. And I was in a rock band. Now I can conduct experiments, but most of all, I think there's a possibility that Lifehouse one day may be a movie or a TV series. It's fun. It's a fun idea, but it's a dark subject. It's a dark subject about how we're dealing with our planet today and how we hope to save it. But at the same time, we still have this, I don't know that it's fair to call spiritual focus a form of narcissism. I don't think it's fair. But many people do say that. I mean, Ricky Gervais says it. Anybody that believes in God is an idiot. And I don't think it's necessarily that we have to believe in God. And I think Ricky himself has, with his recent TV show, actually started to show some, in a sense, openness to the idea that we do have a purpose as human beings to be aware of our spiritual side. But when we're dealing with music, we're dealing with something that's almost magical. We don't know how it works. People can talk about it. You yourself have just talked about having a magical experience at Green's Playhouse. This is weird stuff. So I think the spiritual component of all this is the thing that I hold dearest. And so for me today, having this box set in my hands, I'm looking at it kind of going, yep, it's still here. I'm still having fun with it. And maybe it will provide some uplift. And when I say uplift, I don't mean having a good day and making a few bucks. I mean having a spiritual moment where you feel life is worth living and positive about who we are as people and as creatives. Everybody is creative. No one is special. We're all part of the same great big ballpark.
Let's go out with an absolute bang then, and it could be said that I've saved the very best to last. Let's go back to the original album, and this is the full-length version of the first single I ever bought away back in the summer of 1971. Just kind of tee it up for us, Pete. You know, that amazing song, you know, with the synthesizers and Roger Daltrey's now infamous scream at the very end of the track. You know, how did Won't Get Fooled Again go from, you know, an early demo to what we heard on Who's Next?
Well, it happened, you know, it was a guitar song. It was just me strumming away at a guitar. And it was a reaction to being put under pressure by the hippies of the day to try to save the political scenario of the swing to the right and bring it back to the swing to the left. I had a lot of friends in London who were trying to say to me, you know, you're in this big band and you have a responsibility to stand beside us to save society. And Won't Get Fooled Again was written in a sense to counter that and just say, listen, you know, we're not in a position here to talk about who should lead who. And that song became one of the founding principles of the whole Lifehouse thesis, which is that people in power always up, always, without question. They just always do. They can't help themselves. And unless they become dictators, in which case they get to do exactly what they want. So within their own terms, they're doing okay. But whether or not we agree is another story. But, you know, I took that song in. I decided to add the organ. I actually recorded the organ first. And actually what it was, Billy, was suddenly realizing that Keith Moon, as somebody who always followed the beat, didn't lead the beat, could follow. He could follow the track. So we were able to take this track on the road with us and completely evoke the recorded sound. It wasn't like using backing tracks because our keyboard player couldn't play it. We didn't have a keyboard player. So we would have missed out that noise if we'd have performed that song. And, you know, since then, all drummers follow what they call clicks. You know, they follow somebody. But in those days, if you asked a drummer to play with a click, they would say, I'm the click. You know, I'm the one that sets the tempo and the speed. But Keith had always been a follower. He'd always followed what other people were doing. And so he was quite comfortable just playing along with that track. And so we went into the studio and Jesus, immediately, bang, it exploded into life because Keith turned it into this incredible, massive, powerful engine. Just extraordinary. It was an extraordinary moment. Started off as a very simple, slightly resentful little moaning, complaining song and turned into this towering, vengeful explosion of anger against the idiots that try to tell us how to live.
Pete Townshend, I would like to thank you from the bottom of my heart for giving us your time to talk about the Who's Next Lifehouse 50th Anniversary Edition box set, which is an absolute and total work of art. I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it as a Who fan. I would also like to thank you for, you know, giving us your time on the programme. And most of all, I would like to thank you for a life-changing moment for me on the 21st of October 1971 with my 85 pence ticket in my hand. Seat C number 32 in the stalls of the Greens Playhouse. My feet standing on that famous It's Good, It's Greens carpet. And that is the reason that in 2023 I'm sitting here talking to you now.
Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing. It's very moving. It's nice.
Thank you
nice to know that I got you a proper job.
Thank you very much for that. I'm eternally grateful, and we will bow out with an absolute musical masterpiece from the original album, Who's Next? This is The Who, and Won't Get Fooled Again. As you can imagine, it was absolutely fantastic to spend some time in conversation with the great Pete Townshend and check out the box set Who's Next and Lifehouse.